Esta creencia mesiánica, un tropé común en tiempos de inestabilidad, dio al reclamo de Pugachev una legitimidad increíble en los ojos de los disenfranchised. Cleverly se proclamó a sí mismo como el Resurrected Pedro III, prometiendo abolir la servidumbre, terminar la conscripción y redistribuir la tierra, tocando los deseos y grievances más profundos del campesinado y los cosacos. Es como un juego histórico de teléfono, donde un whisper de un zar muerto se convirtió en un roar de revolución, todo gracias a un impostor carismático que capturaba corazones. La rebelión comenzó en la remota región de los Urales, drawing support from a diverse array of grupos descontentos, siervos de esprit por libertad, viejos creyentes, una minoría religiosa perseguida, grupos étnicos no rusos como los basquires y tártaros que chafed bajo el gobierno ruso, y, más importante, los cosacos independent mindet del río Yaik, Ural, quienes resentían los intentos del gobierno de quertar su autonomía tradicional. Estos cosacos, con sus tradiciones marciales e independencia fierce, formaron la espina dorsal del ejército de Pugachev, como guerreros forjados en las estepas. El uprising rápidamente swelled en una guerra civil full scale, spreading a través de vast swaths del sudeste ruso, con banderas ondeando en vientos de cambio. Las fuerzas de Pugachev capturaron pueblos, establecieron una administración rudimentary, en una inversión horrífica del orden establecido, comenzaron a colgar terratenientes y funcionarios gubernamentales, a menudo de las puertas mismas de sus propias istats, un acto de justicia vengativa que enviaba cibers a través de la nobleza. Imagina el terror de la nobleza y la esperanza de esprit de los siervos mientras esta ola de rebelión barría el countryside, un taid que amenazaba con drown el viejo mundo. Esto no era solo un riot, era un intento de desmantelar fundamentalmente el orden social y político existente, un desafío que se sentía como un terremoto. La respuesta inicial de Catalina a la rebelión fue somewhat hampered por la ongoing guerra ruso-turca, que ataba recursos militares significativos. Inicialmente underestimated la escala y peligro del uprising, dismisiéndolo como merely an local disturbance, un error que casi le cuesta todo. Sin embargo, a medida que la rebelión crecía, threatening ciudades mejor como Kazán y Orenburg, y as reports de atrocidades widespread y el colapso de la autoridad local alcanzaban San Petersburgo, la gravedad de la situación se volvió undeniably clear. La emperatriz, quien había cultivado una imagen de enlightenment intelectual y rule firm but just, ahora enfrentaba un desafío directo y visceral a su autoridad y al contrato social mismo sobre el cual descansaba su imperio. Debe haber sido una experiencia profundamente unsettling para ella, un sudden, violent crack en la facade palish de su reinado enlightened, como un espejo que se quiebra revelando la realidad debajo. Eventualmente, con la conclusión exitosa de la guerra ruso-turca en 1774, Catalina pudo redeploy unidades de ejército regular seasoned bajo generales experimentados, notablemente el general Alexander Suvorov, uno de los comandantes militares más brillantes de Rusia. El ejército imperial disciplined y bien equipado resultó demasiado formidable para las fuerzas campesinas largely undisciplined y poorly armed de Pugachev, a pesar de su fuerza numérica y determinación fierce. El taid de la rebelión comenzó a girar, y el ejército de Pugachev sufrió una serie de defeats decisivas, con batallas que se volvían cada vez más desperate. Pugachev mismo fue betrayed por sus propios seguidores cosacos, eager por asegurar sus propios pardons, y captured en septiembre de 1774. Fue traído a Moscú en una jaula de hierro, un spectacle gruesome diseñado para instill fear y demonstrar el fate inevitable de los rebeldes, como un animal enjaulado para el escarnio público. En enero de 1775, fue publicly executed en la Plaza Bolotnaya de Moscú, su cuerpo drawn and quartered, un display brutal y público de poder imperial y una advertencia grima a cualquiera que osara desafiar al zar, un espectáculo que dejaba a la multitud en silencio aterrorizado. La supresión de la rebelión de Pugachev tuvo consecuencias profundas y lasting para el imperio ruso. Lejos de ushering in nuevas reformas, instilló un miedo conservador profundo en Catalina y sus sucesores. El brief flirtaschen con ideales enlightened dio paso a un renewed énfasis en fortalecer la autocracia y aumentar el control sobre el campesinado. El poder de la nobleza fue further cemented como un bulwark contra future revolts, y la servidumbre, lejos de ser abolida, se volvió aún más rigorously enforced, como cadenas tightened. Catalina también embarcó en reformas administrativas, dividiendo el imperio en provincias y distritos más manejables, fortaleciendo la burocracia local y la fuerza policial, todo diseñado para prevent similar a pressings from taking root, como un web que se teje más tight. Mientras la rebelión misma Fald dejó una marca indeleble, demonstrating las inmensas presiones sociales building beneath the surface of Imperial Granger y Jaila etting los grievances de Piunadre set que continuarían plaguing a Rusia por siglos, ultimately contributing to the empire's eventual downfall. Era un reminder potent y terrifying de que beneath los palacios gilded, la mayoría de la población estaba sufriendo, y su paciencia estaba lejos de infinite, un suspense que se construye hacia el clímax inevitable. Habiendo presenciado el tumulto interno unleashed por la rebelión de Pugachev, ahora pivotamos a un periodo donde Rusia, habiendo afirmado su dominancia en Europa Oriental bajo Catalina la Grande, se encontró drawn en los épicos, continente spanning conflicts de las guerras napoleónicas. Imagina Europa en los finales del siglo XVIII y principios del XIX, un continente en convulsión, shaken primero por la Revolución Francesa y luego por el meteoric rise de Napoleón Bonaparte, un genio militar que redibujó el mapa de Europa con velocidad astonishing y ruthless, como un artista loco con un pincel de sangre. Emerging from the Napoleonic Wars as a dominant European power, Russia, under Alejandro, seemed poised for an era of internal reform, perhaps even a level elevation that would match its newfound international prestige. But remember, the victory against Napoleon had been achieved by an autocratic system, bolstered by a vast army and the deployalty of a populace that largely consisted of serfs. This inherent contradiction between the emperor's fleeting liberal sympathies and the ingrained realities of Russian society would soon lead to a pivotal clash, the Decembrist revolt. Imagine the mood among some of the younger, more educated officers and nobles returning from the wars in Europe. They had witnessed societies with constitutions, civil liberties, and a more vibrant intellectual life. They had fought alongside soldiers from nations where serfdom was a relic of the past, and they returned to a homeland where absolute monarchy and human bondage remained the norm. This exposure to Western ideas, far from strengthening autocracy, planted seeds of discontent and revolutionary fervor. It was almost as if they had gone on a grand tour of enlightenment, only to return home to a dimly lit, outdated palace. Alejandro, initially hailed as a liberal reformer, did indeed dabble with constitutional ideas and even granted a constitution to Congress Poland, but his commitment to genuine reform in Russia itself wavered and ultimately faded. The sheer scale of Russia, the entrenched power of the nobility, and the fear of social upheaval after the Pugachev rebellion weighed heavily on him. His latter years were marked by a growing mysticism and a drift towards more conservative and repressive policies, overseen by figures like General Alexei Arakcheyev, who implemented military settlements known as Arakcheyevshchina, a harsh and unpopular system that combined military service with agricultural labor. This growing conservatism frustrated many of the young, idealistic officers who had fought in the Napoleonic Wars and dreamed of a more modern Russia. These disaffected officers, largely from the gentry class, began to form secret societies, inspired by Masonic lodges and European revolutionary movements. They debated the future of Russia, drafting various proposals ranging from constitutional monarchy to a republican system, all of which involved the abolition of serfdom. The two most prominent groups were the Northern Society, which favored a constitutional monarchy and a more gradual approach to reform, and the Southern Society, led by the more radical Pavel Pestel, which advocated for a republican government and the immediate abolition of serfdom, even considering regicide as a means to achieve their goals. These intellectual salons, often filled with passionate debate and clandestine planning, were a world away from the Tsar's court, yet they harbored the seeds of its undoing. The moment of truth arrived unexpectedly with the sudden death of Alejandro I in December 1825. His death created a succession crisis. Alejandro had no legitimate male heir. His younger brother, Constantine, had secretly renounced his claim to the throne years earlier, but this renunciation was not widely known. The next in line was their younger brother, Nicholas I, a stern and conservative figure. This period of confusion, during which the imperial guard and government officials initially swore allegiance to Constantine, who was in Warsaw and refused to accept, provided the conspirators with a narrow window of opportunity. They decided to act, hoping to capitalize on the uncertainty and rally support for their cause. On December 14, 1825, gens Decembrist, a group of officers, primarily from the Northern Society, led about 3,000 soldiers into Senate Square in St. Petersburg. They refused to swear allegiance to Nicholas, demanding a constitution and a new political order. Imagine the scene: freezing temperatures, a square filled with bewildered soldiers and curious onlookers, facing off against loyalist troops, with the fate of Russia hanging in the balance. It was a dramatic, if somewhat poorly executed, attempt at a military coup. The conspirators, however, lacked a clear leader, a unified plan, and decisive action. Their chosen leader, Princess Sergei Trubetskoy, failed to appear, leaving the rebels leaderless and indecisive. Nicholas I, a man of strong will and decisive action, swiftly rallied loyal troops and, after attempts at negotiation failed, ordered his artillery to open fire on the square. The revolt was crushed within hours, leading to dozens of deaths and hundreds of arrests. The Decembrist revolt, though a dismal failure in its immediate goals, had profound and long-lasting consequences for the Russian Empire. Nicholas I, having witnessed the vulnerability of the autocracy to liberal ideas, became a staunch and uncompromising defender of absolute power. He initiated a period of intense reaction and repression, famously stating, "Revolution is at the threshold of Russia, but is where that it will not enter it as long as he live." He created the third section of His Imperial Majesty's own Chancellery, a powerful secret police force charged with suppressing dissent, censoring public actions, and monitoring all aspects of Russian life. This new apparatus of state control was designed to prevent any future challenges to the autocracy, establishing a pervasive atmosphere of surveillance and fear. Historians still argue whether this reaction was an overzealous response or a necessary measure to preserve stability in a volatile empire. The Decembrists themselves faced harsh punishment. 5 of the leaders, including Pavel Pestel, were executed by hanging, an unprecedented act for noble conspirators in Russia. Hundreds of others were exiled to hard labor in Siberia, their stories becoming a powerful myth of sacrifice and martyrdom for future generations of revolutionaries. The Decembrist revolt solidified Nicholas' autocratic rule and set Russia on a deeply conservative path for the next 3 decades. It pushed intellectual and political discourse underground, forcing revolutionary ideas into clandestine circles, only to re-emerge with even greater force in later centuries. The light of reform that had flickered under Alejandro I was extinguished, replaced by the grim determination of an emperor committed to maintaining order at all costs, ensuring that the legacy of 1825 would continue to reverberate throughout Russia's history. With the Decembrist revolt brutally suppressed, Nicholas I ascended to the throne in an atmosphere sick with suspicion and the grim determination to never again face such a challenge to his autocratic power. Imagine an emperor foiled in the crucible of rebellion, a man who believed that absolute, unyielding authority was the only bulwark against chaos and revolution. His reign, from 1825 to 1855, was defined by a commitment to preserve the existing order, famously encapsulated in his official ideology of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. This wasn't just a catchy slogan, it was the foundational dogma of his rule, a rigid philosophy designed to counter the liberal ideas that believed that infiltrated Russia from the West. Orthodoxy emphasized the supreme role of the Russian Orthodox Church, intertwined with the state. Autocracy declared the Tsar's absolute and unquestionable power, and nationality promoted a sense of unique Russian identity, distinct from Western European influences, often interpreted as Russian chauvinism. It was a complete ideological counter-revolution, a resolute rejection of the very ideas that had inspired the Decembrists. To enforce this rigid ideology and prevent any further outbreaks of revolutionary fervor, Nicholas established a pervasive system of state control and surveillance. The third section of His Imperial Majesty's Own Chancellery, already mentioned, became a powerful and feared secret police force, tasked with monitoring political dissent, censoring public actions, and rooting out any perceived threats to the regime. Imagine living in a society where every letter you wrote, every book you read, every conversation you had, might be subject to the scrutiny of a pervasive state apparatus. This system of pervasive censorship and repression stifled intellectual and artistic expression, forcing many progressive thinkers into internal exile or emigration. Literary figures like Alexander Pushkin and Mikhail Lermontov found themselves under constant surveillance, their works often censored or suppressed. This wasn't just about catching rebels, it was about controlling the very thoughts and ideas circulating within the empire, a truly monumental undertaking. Despite his fear of reform, Nicholas was not entirely blind to the country's problems, particularly the deeply ingrained issue of serfdom. He understood that the system, while providing a stable labor force, was economically inefficient and morally indefensible in an increasingly modern world. He even established numerous secret committees to study the peasant question, genuinely seeking solutions for its abolition. However, his profound fear of the social upheaval that such a radical reform would unleash always prevented him from taking decisive action. He famously stated, "There is no doubt that serfdom, in its present form, is a patent evil, but to touch it now would be a still more disastrous evil." This internal contradiction, the recognition of a grave problem without the political will to solve it, would haunt his reign and contribute to Russia's long-term stagnation. Historians still argue whether his inaction was a sign of genuine caution or simply a profound lack of courage when faced with such a monumental task. In foreign policy, Nicholas was known as the Gendarme of Europe, actively intervening to suppress liberal and nationalist revolutions across the continent. He sent Russian troops to crush the Polish uprising of 1830 a 1831, which sought to restore Polish independence, integrating Poland even more tightly into the Russian Empire and revoking its constitutional autonomy. Later, in 1849, he famously sent Russian forces to assist Austria in suppressing the Hungarian Revolution, earning him the gratitude of the Habsburg monarchy but the enmity of liberals across Europe. These interventions reinforced Russia's image as a reactionary power, a bulwark against the forces of change sweeping through Europe. It was almost as if he saw himself as Europe's chief firefighter, constantly rushing to extinguish the flames of revolution wherever they appeared. Economically, Russia under Nicholas remained largely agrarian, with its vast majority of the population tied to the land. Industrialization proceeded at a much slower pace compared to Western Europe, largely due to the constraints of serfdom and the autocratic government's general aversion to social change. While some railways were built, notably the line connecting St. Petersburg and Moscow, and early industrial enterprises began to emerge, Russia's economic development lagged significantly behind its European rivals, a fact that would become painfully apparent in the coming decades. This economic backwardness, coupled with the rigid social structure and the autocratic rule, created a growing chasm between Russia and the rapidly industrializing and modernizing West. The ultimate test of Nicholas' system, and the event that would expose its fundamental weaknesses, was the Crimean War, 1853 a 1856. This conflict, initially sparked by disputes over holy places in the Ottoman Empire, quickly escalated into a major European confrontation involving Russia against a coalition of the Ottoman Empire, Great Britain, France, and Sardinia. Imagine the arrogance of a powerful emperor, convinced of his army's invincibility, only to be confronted with the grim reality of modern warfare. The war, fought largely on the Crimean Peninsula, revealed the stark technological and logistical deficiencies of the Russian Empire. Russian soldiers, though brave, were often poorly equipped, armed with outdated muskets, and hampered by a primitive railway system that made supplying troops incredibly difficult. The antiquated sailing ships of the Russian Navy were no match for the steam-powered fleets of Britain and France. The widespread corruption within the army and the bureaucracy further exacerbated these problems. The defeat, a humiliating blow to Russian prestige, shattered the illusion of imperial invincibility and exposed the urgent need for fundamental reforms. It was a wake-up call, a harsh reckoning that demonstrated the severe limitations of a state built on serfdom and autocracy in an age of rapid technological and social change. Nicholas I, the unyielding defender of autocracy, died in 1855, just before the end of the war, his reign ending in failure and a profound sense of disillusionment, leaving his home with an empire in crisis. The humiliating defeat in the Crimean War cast alone, cold shadow over Russia, exposing the deep cracks in the edifice of Nicholas's autocratic system and proving beyond a doubt that the empire, despite its vastness, was dangerously backward. Imagine the collective shock and dismay that rippled through Russian society as news of the catastrophic losses and the technological superiority of the Allied forces reached every corner of the empire. It was a brutal awakening, forcing the realization that the grand vision of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality simply couldn't compete with the modern industrial and military might of Western Europe. It was as if Russia had entered the cutting-edge, high-tech war with a sword and shield, only to be utterly outmatched by cannons and steamships. Into this atmosphere of national crisis and a desperate need for change stepped Alejandro II, who ascended the throne in 1855, inheriting not just an empire but a profound burden of reform. Unlike his father, Nicholas I, who had feared change above all else, Alejandro II understood that radical reform was no longer a choice but a necessity for Russia's survival as a great power. He famously declared, "It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait until it begins to abolish itself from below," a clear acknowledgement of the growing social pressures and the lessons learned from Pugachev's rebellion. This wasn't merely a pragmatic decision. It was a deeply complex moral and political undertaking that would redefine the very fabric of Russian society. The defining act of Alejandro I's reign, the one that earned him the moniker Tsar Liberate, was the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. Imagine the sighs of relief, the hesitant joy, and the immense confusion that swept across the vast Russian countryside as the Tsar's manifesto was read aloud in churches and villages. This monumental decree, freeing approximately 23 million privately owned serfs and an additional 20 million state peasants, was the single largest emancipation of people in history. It was a truly revolutionary act, dismantling a system that had been entrenched for centuries and upon which the entire social and economic structure of Russia rested. However, historians still argue whether the emancipation was a true liberation or a flawed compromise that ultimately created new problems. While the serfs gained personal freedom and the right to own property, they were required to pay redemption payments over 49 years to their former landlords for the land allotted to them. This often left them with insufficient land, burdened by debt, and still tied to their peasant communes, the mir, which were responsible for collecting the payments. So, while chains were broken, new economic ones were forged, leading to widespread disappointment among the peasantry and contributing to future social unrest. It was a grand gesture that, upon closer inspection, revealed a complex and often painful reality for the newly free peasants. The emancipation was just the beginning of Alejandro I's great reforms. Recognizing the need for a modern state, he initiated a series of comprehensive transformations. E introduced the Semsbo reform in 1864, establishing elected local self-government bodies at the district and provincial levels. These Semsbos, composed of representatives from all social classes, were responsible for local education, healthcare, road maintenance, and agricultural development. This was a significant step towards decentralized administration and greater public participation, a nascent form of local democracy in an autocratic state. Imagine the surprise of local peasants and gentry suddenly sitting together, debating and deciding on local issues. He also reformed the judicial system, introducing public trials, trial by jury, and independent judges in 1864, replacing the old, corrupt, and arbitrary system. This was a radical departure, bringing Russia closer to Western legal norms and establishing a degree of rule of law. Furthermore, military reforms were implemented, including universal conscription, replacing the old, brutal 25-year service for serfs with a shorter, compulsory service for all classes, and a modernization of training and equipment, directly addressing the lessons of the Crimean War. Education reforms saw an increase in the number of schools and universities, and restrictions on university autonomy were loosened, fostering a more vibrant intellectual life. Censorship, though still present, was relaxed compared to Nicholas Isran, leading to a blossoming of the press and public debate. However, despite these sweeping reforms, Alejandro II remained an autocrat, unwilling to relinquish his supreme power or introduce a constitution. This fundamental contradiction, liberal reforms within an autocratic framework, created growing frustration among the educated elite and nascent revolutionary groups who felt the reforms did not go far enough. The Tsar's wavering commitment, combined with the slow pace of change and the lingering economic problems of the peasantry, fueled a new wave of radicalism. Students and intellectuals, disillusioned by the limited scope of the reforms, began to embrace revolutionary ideologies, from populism to nihilism. This was a period when the very reforms designed to stabilize Russia inadvertently created the conditions for further unrest, as rising expectations met persistent limitations. Tragically, Alejandro I's reign ended in violence. After several assassination attempts, he was killed by a bomb thrown by a member of the revolutionary group People's Will in March 1881. On the very day he was reportedly considering signing a document that would have established a limited representative assembly. His assassination was a devastating blow to the reform movement in Russia, ushering in a period of severe reaction and fundamentally altering the trajectory of the empire. It was a grim irony. A reformist Tsar brought down by the very forces of radicalism that his partial reforms had, in part, inadvertently nurtured, ending an era of profound transformation with a brutal act of violence that would reverberate through the remaining decades of the Russian Empire. The assassination of Alejandro II, the Tsar Liberate, sent a profound shockwave through the Russian Empire, halting the momentum of reform and ushering in an era of resolute reaction. Imagine the collective horror and fear among the ruling elite, a Tsar who had dared to break the chains of serfdom and introduce sweeping modernizations, violently murdered by revolutionaries. This act, far from igniting a popular uprising, had the opposite effect, creating a deep-seated revulsion for radicalism and strengthening the hand of conservative forces within the government. It was a stark, brutal lesson, attempts at loverelesation, in the eyes of many at the top, had seemingly only led to anarchy and regicide. Alejandro y his successor, his son Alejandro III, who reigned from 1881 to 1894, was profoundly affected by his father's violent death. He viewed the reforms as having unleashed dangerous forces and believed that the only way to subvert was to reassert unwavering autocracy. He was a man of immense physical strength and an unyielding will, a stark contrast to his more wavering father. He saw himself as a bulwark against the tide of liberalism and revolution, much like his grandfather Nicholas I. It's almost as if he decided, enough with this Western nonsense, it's time to put Russia back on its true, autocratic path. His reign became characterized by a policy of counter-reforms, systematically rolling back many of the liberal innovations of his father and strengthening the central, autocratic state. The most immediate and comprehensive of Alejandro I's counter-reforms was the strengthening of the secret police and the imposition of even tighter controls over public life. The infamous Okhrana, Department for Protecting the Public Security and Order, was greatly expanded, becoming a highly effective, though brutally repressive, political police force. Imagine a vast network of informers, agents provocateurs, and pervasive surveillance, reaching into every corner of society, relentlessly hunting down suspected revolutionaries and dissidents. Press censorship was tightened, university autonomy was curtailed, and the powers of the Sembos were significantly reduced, bringing local self-government more directly under central government control. Justice, too, reverted to a more arbitrary form, with increased use of administrative exile and summary trials for political offenses, circumventing the more liberal judicial system established by his father. This was a deliberate effort to dismantle the very mechanisms that had allowed for a semblance of public discourse and local initiative. Alejandro III also pursued a policy of Russification with renewed vigor, aimed at consolidating the empire by imposing Russian language, culture, and the Orthodox faith on its numerous non-Russian ethnic minorities. In Finland, Poland, the Baltic provinces, and Ukraine, local languages were suppressed in schools and administration, and Orthodox Christianity was promoted over Catholicism, Protestantism, and other faiths. This policy was particularly harsh against the Jewish population, leading to an increase in discriminatory laws and state-sanctioned pogroms, violent anti-Jewish riots that resulted in widespread death and destruction. Historians still argue whether these pogroms were directly orchestrated by the state or simply tolerated and encouraged by its anti-Semitic policies, but their devastating impact on Jewish communities across the Pale of Settlement is undeniable. This forced cultural assimilation, far from unifying the empire, often created the resentment and fueled nationalist movements among the very groups it sought to suppress, sowing seeds of future unrest and ethnic strife. Despite this intensely conservative and repressive internal policy, Alejandro I's reign was largely peaceful in terms of foreign policy. He avoided major wars, earning him the moniker the Peacemaker Tsar. He prioritized internal stability and economic development over military adventures, allowing Russia to recover from the exhaustion of the Crimean War and the costly conquests of Catalina the Great. This focus on peace and internal consolidation allowed for a period of economic growth, particularly in industrialization, which began to pick up pace under the guidance of finance ministers like Sergei Witte. Imagine the immense paradox. A fiercely autocratic regime inadvertently facilitating the very industrialization that would eventually create a large urban working class, a fertile ground for the revolutionary ideologies it so desperately sought to suppress. The construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, though began towards the very end of his reign, was emblematic of this drive for economic modernization and imperial integration. This colossal project, spanning thousands of miles across Siberia, was designed to connect European Russia with the Pacific coast, facilitating trade, resource extraction, and military deployment. It was a massive undertaking, showcasing Russia's engineering ambition and its determination to assert its presence across the vast Eurasian landmass. However, beneath the surface of peace and industrial growth, profound social and political tensions continued to fester. The repression of the government pushed revolutionary activity further underground, leading to the formation of more radical and clandestine groups, often embracing increasingly violent methods. The unresolved peasant question, despite the emancipation, continued to be a source of discontent, as many peasants struggled with land shortages and debt. The burgeoning industrial working class, living in often appalling conditions in the rapidly growing cities, became another potential force for unrest, susceptible to revolutionary propaganda. Alejandro III died prematurely in 1894, leaving to his son, Nicholas II, an empire that, while outwardly strong and stable, harbored deep-seated contradictions. He had successfully quelled revolutionary movements for a time, but his policies of reaction had done little to address the fundamental causes of discontent, instead merely suppressing the symptoms. The stage was now set for the final, tragic act of the Russian Empire, and the Tsar prepared to confront the gathering storm. From the stern, unyielding reign of Alejandro III, we transition to the final, tragic chapter of the Russian Empire, presided over by Nicholas II. Imagine a young, deeply religious, and devoted family man, thrust onto the throne of a vast, complex, and increasingly volatile empire, utterly unprepared for the monumental challenges that awaited him. Nicholas II, who reigned from 1894 to 1917, was a man of weak will and limited political acumen, often indecisive, prone to superstition, and deeply committed to preserving the autocratic principles inherited from his father, despite the clear signs that Russia was rapidly outgrowing such an antiquated system. He famously dismissed the idea of a constitutional monarchy as senseless dreams, clinging to the notion of his divine right to rule, even as the world around him clamored for change. It was as if the empire had an increasingly complex operating system, and the emperor was still running on a medieval dial-up modem, utterly overwhelmed by the sheer demands of the new era. Nicholas' early reign continued the policies of his father, marked by continued Russification, a strengthened Ukraine, and a general suppression of liberal and revolutionary movements. However, beneath this veneer of stability, Russia was undergoing profound social and economic transformations that would ultimately undermine the very autocracy Nicholas was so determined to preserve. The most significant of these was rapid industrialization, spurred on by the policies of Finance Minister Sergei Witte. Witte, a visionary economist, championed the state-led industrial development, attracting foreign investment, building railroads, including the continued expansion of the Trans-Siberian Railway, and promoting heavy industry. Imagine the smokestacks rising across the Russian landscape, the roar of new factories, and the rapid growth of urban centers like St. Petersburg and Moscow. This industrial boom, while impressive in its statistics, came at a heavy social cost. A new, rapidly growing urban working class emerged, toiling in harsh conditions, living in overcrowded slums, and earning meager wages. This environment, ripe for exploitation, became a fertile ground for revolutionary agitation, as socialist and communist ideas, imported from Western Europe, found receptive ears among the alienated and downtrodden factory workers. Simultaneously, the peasant question remained largely unresolved. Despite the emancipation, most peasants still suffered from land shortages, high redemption payments, and a backward agricultural system. Periodic famines continued to plague the countryside, and the deep-seated resentment against the landowning nobility and the government simmered. This vast peasant majority, though largely unorganized, represented an enormous potential force for revolution, a slumbering giant that could be awakened by the right spark. Meanwhile, the growing intelligentsia, frustrated by the lack of political freedom and the government's repressive policies, increasingly turned to radical ideologies. Liberal elements sought constitutional reforms and civil liberties, while various socialist parties, including the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which would later split into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, gained traction among workers and intellectuals, advocating for a complete overthrow of the autocratic system. The stage was set for a multifaceted challenge to the Tsar's absolute power, coming from different social strata and advocating vastly different solutions. Nicholas his personal characteristics, unfortunately, made him ill-suited to navigate these turbulent waters. He lacked the political shrewdness of Catalina the Great or the decisive will of Pedro the Great. He preferred to delegate authority to incompetent or corrupt ministers, often making decisions based on personal loyalties rather than merit. His strong belief in his divine mission meant he often resisted any advice that suggested a limitation of his autocratic power, even when such limitations might have sapped the monarchy. His infamous reliance on the mystical Siberian peasant Grigory Rasputin, particularly after his son and heir, Alexei, was diagnosed with hemophilia, further undermined the prestige and legitimacy of the imperial family. Imagine the whispers and scandal within the court and among the public, as a semi-literate mystic gained unparalleled influence over the Empress Alexandra and, through her, the Tsar himself, making decisions on appointments and policy. This bizarre relationship was a constant source of scandal and deeply damaged the public image of the monarchy, making it seem out of touch and incompetent. The burgeoning internal tensions within Russia were further exacerbated by Nicholas's ambitious and often miscalculated foreign policy. Driven by a desire for imperial expansion and a belief in Russia's destiny as a great power, a push for influence in the Far East, particularly in Korea and Manchuria. This expansionist drive inevitably brought Russia into direct conflict with another rising imperial power, Japan. The stage was set for a military confrontation that would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation and would expose, in the most painful way possible, the deep-seated weaknesses of the Russian Empire, setting the stage for the first of many revolutionary tremors that would ultimately bring down the Romanov dynasty. The next major shock to the imperial system was not to come from internal revolution, but from a surprising and humiliating defeat on the world stage. The mounting internal pressures of industrialization, an unresolved peasant question, and a frustrated intelligentsia, all simmering under the ineffective rule of Nicholas II, were about to boil over, not from within, but ignited by a disastrous foreign war. Imagine the sheer disbelief and humiliation that swept through Russia when news began to filter back from the Far East. The mighty Russian Empire, supposedly a great European power, was being decisively defeated by a seemingly minor Asian nation, Japan. This was the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 a 1905, a conflict born out of imperial ambitions colliding in Manchuria and Korea, and it proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation for the Romanov autocracy. For many, it was the definitive proof that the Tsar's government was not only oppressive but also utterly incompetent. Nicholas II, driven by a desire for a small victorious war to boost national prestige and distract from domestic problems, and underestimating Japan's military capabilities, had pushed for confrontation. His advisers, particularly in the Far East, often encouraged this expansionist policy, seeing it as an easy route to glory. The geographical distances involved were immense. Russia to transport troops and supplies thousands of miles along the single-track Trans-Siberian Railway, a logistical nightmare that crippled its war effort. Japan, in contrast, was a rapidly modernizing nation with a highly efficient and well-prepared military and naval force. It was a classic David and Goliath story, except this time, David had surprisingly modern weaponry and a much better strategy. The war began with a surprise Japanese naval attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in February 1904, a move that crippled the Russian Pacific Squadron and established Japanese naval superiority. This initial blow was followed by a series of humiliating land defeats for Russia, including the Battle of Mukden in February-March 1905, one of the largest land battles in history prior to World War I, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers engaged in a brutal, prolonged struggle. The most catastrophic defeat, however, occurred at sea, the Battle of Tsushima Strait in mayo de 1905. Here, the entire Russian Baltic Fleet, which had sailed halfway around the world for 8 months to reinforce the Pacific Fleet, was virtually annihilated by Admiral Togo Eiichiro's mother Japanese Navy. Imagine the sheer audacity and desperation of sending a fleet on such a monumental journey, only for it to be utterly destroyed in a matter of hours. This naval catastrophe was a profound shock to Russian national pride and a clear demonstration of the empire's military and technological backwardness. Historians still debate whether the decision to send the Baltic Fleet on such a futile mission was a testament to imperial stubbornness or simply an act of supreme folly. The news of these repeated, humiliating defeats, coupled with the immense human cost and the severe economic strain of the war, ignited widespread public discontent across Russia. The war exacerbated existing grievances, food shortages, rising prices, factory closures, and widespread unemployment. The illusion of the Tsar's infallibility, already chipped away by his perceived weakness and Rasputin's influence, shattered completely. The war became the catalyst that transformed simmering discontent into open rebellion, proving that even a small victorious war could have the exact opposite effect. The war's devastating impact directly triggered the 1905 revolution, beginning with the horrific events of Bloody Sunday on January 22, 1905. On that day, thousands of unarmed workers, led by the Orthodox priest Father Gapon, marched peacefully to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to present a petition to the Tsar, pleading for better working conditions, civil liberties, and an end to the war. They genuinely believed the Tsar would listen, seeing him as a benevolent father figure who was simply unaware of their suffering. Imagine the scene, a hopeful, if naive, crowd, carrying icons and portraits of the Tsar, approaching the palace gates. However, instead of a sympathetic reception, they were met by Imperial Guard troops who opened fire indiscriminately, killing and wounding hundreds. This unprovoked massacre shattered the centuries-old myth of the benevolent Tsar, forever severing the bond of trust between the monarch and his people. It was a turning point, transforming loyalty into bitter resentment and sparking a wave of protests, strikes, and riots across the empire. The blood spilled on that cold January day stand the reputation of the Romanov dynasty beyond repair. The humiliation of the war and the trauma of Bloody Sunday unleashed a torrent of revolutionary activity. Strikes perilous factories and railways, peasant uprisings erupted in the countryside, and even segments of the military mutinied, most famously on the battleship Potemkin. Councils of workers, delegates, known as Soviets, spontaneously emerged in cities like St. Petersburg, demonstrating a nascent form of popular self-organization. Facing an empire on the brink of collapse, Nicholas II, advised by the pragmatic Sergei Witte, was forced to make concessions. In October 1905, he reluctantly issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties, freedom of speech, assembly, and conscience, and, most significantly, the creation of a directly elected legislative assembly, the State Duma, without whose consent no law would be passed. The October Manifesto temporarily quelled the revolution by satisfying moderate liberals and dividing the opposition. It seemed, for a brief moment, that Russia was on the path to becoming a constitutional monarchy. However, Nicholas II, still clinging to his autocratic principles, considered the Duma a temporary concession rather than a permanent shift in power. He quickly sought to limit its authority, dissolving the first two Dumas when they proved too independent. The fundamental tension between an autocratic ruler and a society increasingly demanding change remained unresolved. The Russo-Japanese War, therefore, was not merely a military defeat, it was the spark that ignited the first full-scale revolution in Russia, exposing the fatal weaknesses of the Tsarist regime and setting a precedent for popular uprising that would ultimately culminate in the empire's final collapse just over a decade later. The cracks that had appeared in the empire's foundation were now gaping fissures, impossible to ignore. The embers of the 1905 revolution, though dampened by the October Manifesto and the creation of the Duma, continued to smolder beneath the surface of Russian society, ready to reignite at the slightest provocation. Imagine a ruler, Nicholas II, who, after being forced to grant limited reforms, immediately set about undermining them, convinced that his divine right to rule was inviolable. This inherent contradiction between the Tsar's autocratic convictions and the growing aspirations of his people meant that the period after 1905 was less a time of genuine constitutionalism and more volatile dance between limited liberalization and renewed repression. It was a bit like offering someone a tiny sip of water after they've been parched for days, only to immediately snatch the cup away. Following the initial revolutionary fervor, the government, under the guidance of pragmatic ministers like Pyotr Stolypin, attempted to restore order and implement reforms that aimed to stabilize the empire without fundamentally altering the autocratic system. Stolypin, a strong proponent of the monarchy but also a ruthless pragmatist, believed that Russia needed a period of strong, decisive leadership to avoid collapse. It was like a stern, no-nonsense doctor attempting to cure a very sick patient, using a combination of bitter medicine and careful surgery. His initial focus was on suppressing the remaining revolutionary activity, establishing military field courts that quickly and brutally tried and executed suspected terrorists, a policy so harsh that the gallows became known as Stolypin's necktie. This repression was effective in the short term, driving revolutionary movements further underground. However, Stolypin's vision was not purely repressive. He understood that long-term stability required addressing the root causes of discontent. His most significant and controversial reform was the Stolypin Agrarian Reform, initiated in 1906. This aimed to dissolve the traditional peasant commune, MIR, and create a class of independent, prosperous peasant proprietors, a rural middle class, who would serve as a conservative bulwark against revolution. Peasants were encouraged to consolidate their scattered strips of land into single, privately owned farms, and significant state loans were offered to those willing to move to Siberia and develop new lands. Historians still argue whether these reforms were truly successful. While millions of peasants did consolidate their holdings and move eastward, creating a more productive agricultural sector in some areas, the vast majority of peasants remained trapped in poverty and traditional communal farming. It was a bold attempt to transform the Russian countryside, but it faced immense resistance from deeply ingrained traditions and economic realities. Politically, the State Duma, created by the October Manifesto, became a battleground between the Tsar's government and various political factions. Nicholas II, true to his autocratic nature, repeatedly dissolved the first two Dumas when they proved too critical or too demanding of constitutional change. In 1907, Stolypin engineered a change to the electoral law, effectively disenfranchising many peasants and workers and ensuring that future Dumas would be more conservative and more amenable to the government. This was a clear sign that the Tsar saw the Duma not as a truly representative legislative body, but as a consultative assembly that existed at his pleasure. Despite these limitations, the Duma did provide a forum for political debate and criticism, and some moderate parties, like the Octobrists and Cadets, constitutional Democrats, tried to work within the system to push for further reforms. The period between 1907 and 1914 saw a fragile stability, a period of economic growth and relative peace. Rasche continued its industrial development, and its military was slowly modernizing. However, the fundamental problems remained unresolved. The vast social inequalities persisted, the peasant question lingered, and the urban working class remained exploited and increasingly radicalized. Nicholas Is continued reliance on figures like Rasputin, whose influence over the imperial family seemed to grow even stronger, continued to erode public trust in the monarchy, generating widespread scandal and outrage among the educated classes and even within the nobility. The whispers and rumors about Rasputin's dark influence became an open secret, a symbol of the monarchy's detachment and vulnerability. While domestic tensions simmered, Russia's foreign policy increasingly focused on the Balkans and its role as the protector of Orthodox Slavs within the crumbling Ottoman Empire. This brought Russia into direct conflict with Austria-Hungary, which had its own ambitions in the region, and indirectly with Germany, Austria-Hungary is a powerful ally. The complex web of alliances and rivalries among the European powers was tightening, creating an incredibly dangerous powder keg. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 provided the spark. Russia, bound by its alliance with Serbia and its role as a pan-Slavic protector, mobilized its vast army in response to Austria-Hungary's declaration of war on Serbia. This mobilization, in turn, triggered Germany's declaration of war on Russia and France, engulfing the entire continent in what would become the most devastating conflict the world had ever seen, World War I. Nicholas II, with his characteristic blend of weak will and misplaced conviction, led Russia into the war with a genuine belief in its righteousness and a naive hope that it would rally the nation around the throne. He famously stood on the balcony of the Winter Palace, accepting the cheers of the crowd, a seemingly popular act that concealed the depth of visions beneath. However, the Great War would prove to be the ultimate test of the Romanov autocracy, a test it was destined to fall. The immense scale of modern warfare, the sheer brutality of the front lines, and the colossal logistical demands would prove too much for a system already teetering on the brink. The entry into World War I would accelerate the empire's downfall, transforming simmering discontent into a full-blown revolutionary inferno that would ultimately consume the very monarchy it was meant to protect. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 initially sparked a wave of patriotic fervor across Russia, momentarily uniting a deeply divided society around the Tsar and the flag. Imagine the scenes in the bustling squares of St. Petersburg and Moscow, crowds cheering for Nicholas II, soldiers marching off to the front with flowers tucked into their rifle barrels, and the fervent belief that this great war would be short and victorious, cementing Russia's glory and perhaps even resolving its internal woes. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that the nationalistic sentiment could indeed overcome the deep-seated grievances that had fueled the 1905 revolution. Nicholas II himself, genuinely believing in Russia's divine mission to protect its Slavic brethren, felt a renewed sense of purpose, hoping the war would redeem his struggling run. It was a brief, intoxicating period where the immense societal pressure seemed to evaporate in a haze of patriotic delusion. However, this fragile unity quickly disintegrated under the brutal realities of modern warfare. The sheer scale and prolonged nature of World War I were unlike anything Russia had ever faced. The initial Russian offensives into East Prussia, though intended to relieve pressure on France, ended in catastrophic defeats at the battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes in the autumn of 1914. These early losses revealed the deep-seated problems plaguing the Russian military: inadequate training, severe shortages of rifles, ammunition, and artillery, and incompetent leadership. Imagine soldiers being sent to the front with barely a rifle for every 2 men, forced to wait for their cameras to fall before they could pick up a weapon. This was not a small victorious war, it was a meat grinder on an industrial scale. As the war dragged on, the human cost became astronomical. Millions of Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, far more than any other combatant nation. The vast and poorly equipped army, often led by aristocratic generals with little modern military experience, suffered one devastating defeat after another on the Eastern Front. The Russian heartland, though far from the fighting, was crippled by the war's economic demands. Food and fuel shortages became endemic in the cities, leading to skyrocketing prices and widespread hunger. Factories struggled to maintain production, transportation networks buckled under the strain of military logistics, and inflation soared, rapidly eroding the purchasing power of ordinary citizens. While the war effort devoured resources, the common people starved and froze, fueling a growing sense of desperation and resentment. The Tsar's personal leadership during the war proved to be another critical blow to the monarchy's legitimacy. In 1915, Nicholas II made the fateful decision to take personal command of the Russian army at the front, leaving the governance of the empire to his wife, Empress Alexandra, and her increasingly influential confidant, Grigory Rasputin. Historians still argue whether this decision was a patriotic act or a profound error in judgment. It certainly placed the blame for all military failures squarely on the Tsar's shoulders, while his absence from the capital left a power vacuum that was disastrously filled. Alexandra, a strong-willed but deeply unpopular empress of German descent, was widely mistrusted and believed to be under the complete sway of Rasputin. Imagine the whispers that spread through society. A foreign-born empress, under the spell of a Siberian mystic, making crucial decisions that affected the lives of millions. This bizarre and scandalous influence of Rasputin, already a source of deep concern, reached its peak during the war, as his interference in government appointments and his scandalous behavior further eroded public confidence in the monarchy. Even conservative monarchists and members of the royal family pleaded with the Tsar to remove him, but Nicholas, driven by his wife's devotion and his own faith in the holy man's ability to help his hemophiliac son Alexei, remained deaf to their warnings. The situation became so dire that, in December 1916, a group of high-ranking aristocrats and politicians, including Prince Felix Yusupov, assassinated Rasputin, hoping his removal would save the monarchy. Imagine the desperate, almost amateurish nature of the plot, involving poison, shooting, and finally, drowning, a dramatic final act for a figure who had so tragically undermined the credibility of the Romanovs. However, Rasputin's death came too late, the damage to the monarchy's reputation was irreparable, and his removal did nothing to stem the tide of discontent. The political system was collapsing, as ministers were appointed and dismissed with bewildering frequency, creating an atmosphere of chronic instability and demonstrating the utter dysfunction at the top. By early 1917, Russia was a nation teetering on the brink. The war, which was meant to unify, had instead exposed and exacerbated every existing social, economic, and political fault line. The cities were gripped by hunger and cold, the army was demoralized and mutinous, and the Tsar had lost the fight of virtually every segment of society, from the liberal Duma politicians to the conservative nobility and the increasingly radicalized workers and peasants. The long-suffering Russian people, after years of war, sacrifice, and the perceived incompetence of their rulers, were finally reaching their breaking point. The stage was set for the final, decisive act of the Russian Revolution, a rapid and unexpected collapse that would end centuries of autocratic rule and reshape the course of the 20th century. The Great War had not only brought Russia to its knees but had also ignited the revolutionary flames that would consume the very empire it was fighting to defend. From the crucible of World War I, where Russia bled profusely on the Eastern Front, the empire finally reached its breaking point, culminating in the swift and largely unexpected February Revolution of 1917. Imagine the scene in Petrograd, as St. Petersburg had been renamed to soundless German during the war, freezing temperatures, bread lines stretching for blocks, desperate women and children shivering in the snow, and the ever-present rumor of impending famine. The war had utterly crippled the home front, transforming a simmering cauldron of discontent into a raging inferno. For months, strikes had been mounting, not used for better wages but for bread and peace, a simple but powerful cry that encapsulated the profound suffering of the working class and the peasantry. The immediate spark came on International Women's Day, February 23, March 8 by the Gregorian calendar, when thousands of female textile workers in Petrograd went on strike, demanding bread. Their protest quickly swelled, drawing in other factory workers and disaffected citizens. Imagine the police and Cossack patrols, usually ruthless in suppressing dissent, finding themselves hesitant to fire on crowds largely composed of women and children. This initial hesitation was a critical deviation from previous crackdowns, signaling a profound shift in the loyalty of the armed forces. As the days progressed, the strikes escalated into a general strike, paralyzing the capital. Public transport ceased, shops closed, and the streets filled with protesters demanding an end to the war and the autocratic regime. The sheer scale and spontaneity of the uprising caught everyone by surprise, from the Tsar to the various revolutionary parties. Nicholas II, far away at army headquarters in Mohilev, remained tragically out of touch with the gravity of the situation. He dismissed reports of unrest as mere hooliganism and ordered his troops to suppress the protests with force. This was a fatal miscalculation, echoing the disastrous Bloody Sunday of 1905, but this time, the outcome would be different. On February 27, critical regiments of the Petrograd garrison, many of whom were raw recruits or veterans disillusioned by the war, began to mutiny. Instead of firing on the protesters, they joined them, turning their rifles on their officers and opening the gates of prisons. Imagine the shock and jubilation as soldiers, the supposed warranters of imperial authority, sided with the people. This wholesale defection of the military transformed a protest into a revolution, signaling the complete collapse of the Tsar's authority in the capital. With the military defecting and the streets in chaos, two rival centers of power rapidly emerged in Petrograd, the Provisional Committee of the State Duma and the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers, deputies. The Duma, which Nicholas II had contemptuously dissolved days earlier, formed a Provisional Committee of liberal politicians, recognizing the need to restore order and establish a new government. At the same time, revolutionary workers and mutinous soldiers, remembering the Soviets of 1905, spontaneously reformed the Petrograd Soviet, a grassroots council representing the will of the revolutionary masses. This dual power structure, a kind of an easy truce between the liberal bourgeoisie and the radical workers and soldiers, would define the political landscape of Russia for the next 8 months. Faced with the complete collapse of authority in the capital, mutinies in the army, and appeals from his generals and even some members of his own family, Nicholas II finally recognized the inevitable. On March 2, 1917, March 15 by the Gregorian calendar, Honorable Karinskov reluctantly signed his abdication. He initially tried to abdicate in favor of his son, Alexei, but medical advice about Alexei's hemophilia led him to abdicate for himself and his son, in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich. However, Michael, fearing for his life and recognizing the popular rejection of monarchy, wisely declined the throne, stating he would only accept if offered by a truly representative constituent assembly. Imagine the final, bitter stroke of the pen, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule, not with a ban, but with a whimper, a quiet signing in a train carriage. The end of the Romanov dynasty, after over 300 years, was remarkably swift and bloodless in its initial stages. The February Revolution was largely a spontaneous uprising driven by hunger, war weariness, and a complete loss of faith in the autocratic government. It was held by liberals and socialists alike as a triumph of popular will, a glorious, almost joyful, liberation from centuries of oppression. The streets of Petrograd, once filled with protesters, now celebrated with parades and speeches, showcasing a newfound sense of freedom and hope. The provisional government, formed by the Duma liberals and led first by Prince George Lvov and later by the eloquent socialist revolutionary Alexander Kerensky, immediately declared civil liberties, dissolved the Okhrana, and promised elections for a constituent assembly that would determine Russia's future form of government. It truly seemed like a new dawn for Russia, a transition from autocracy to democracy. However, the provisional government faced immense challenges from the outset. It inherited a country still embroiled in a disastrous war, an economy in shambles, and a populace with skyhigh expectations for immediate and radical change, particularly regarding land redistribution and an end to the war. Critically, the provisional government insisted on continuing Russia's participation in World War I, believing it was honor-bound to its allies and that a revolutionary Russia could not abandon the struggle against German militarism. This decision, however, proved to be its fatal flaw, alienating the war-weary soldiers, workers, and peasants who desired peace above all else. The dual power structure also created constant friction, with the Petrograd Soviet often challenging the authority of the provisional government. The euphoria of February quickly faded as the new government struggled to deliver on its promises, leaving the door open for more radical forces to seize the initiative. The euphoria of the February Revolution, which had so swiftly toppled the Romanov dynasty, quickly gave way to a period of deepening crisis for the provisional government. Imagine a fragile new administration, born out of popular uprising, trying to steer a colossal, wounded ship through a maelstrom, while simultaneously debating its destination with a fractious crew. The dual power structure, where the provisional government theoretically held the state authority but the Petrograd Soviet commanded the loyalty of the workers and soldiers, created a paralyzing paralysis. It was like having two captains on one ship, each shouting different orders, ensuring nothing truly got done. This fundamental instability, coupled with the immense, unaddressed grievances of the populace, created a vacuum into which increasingly radical forces would inevitably step. The most critical mistake of the provisional government, and the one that sealed its fate, was its unwavering commitment to continuing Russia's participation in World War I, led first by Prince Lvov and then by the eloquent but ultimately ineffective Alexander Kerensky. The government believed it was their national duty to honor alliances and fight against German militarism. However, the vast majority of Russian soldiers, workers, and peasants were utterly exhausted by the war. They yearned for peace, land, and bread, simple demands that the provisional government, beholden to its Western allies and fearful of social upheaval, simply could not deliver. Offensive after offensive launched by the provisional government, often against the advice of military leaders and with flagging morale, led to further catastrophic losses and mass desertions. Imagine entire regiments simply abandoning the front lines, their will to fight utterly broken, wanting only to return home to their families and their land. This continued bleeding on the battlefield drained the last vestiges of popular support for the government. As the provisional government faltered, struggling with an escalating economic crisis and a disintegrating army, the Bolsheviks, a radical Marxist faction led by the utterly brilliant and ruthless Vladimir Lenin, rapidly gained influence. Lenin, who had been in exile in Switzerland, famously returned to Russia in April 1917, facilitated by the German government which hoped they would further destabilize Russia. Upon his arrival, he immediately issued his April Dies, a clear and uncompromising call for all power to the Soviets, an end to the war, nationalization of land, and a transition from a bourgeois to a socialist revolution. This provided a concise, powerful, and understandable platform that resonated deeply with the masses, a start contrast to the provisional government's vague premises and continued war effort. While other socialist parties differed and debated, Lenin offered a clear, actionable plan. The summer of 1917 saw a series of crises that further undermined the provisional government. The disastrous June offensive on the Eastern Front, intended to be a decisive victory, instead resulted in massive casualties and widespread demoralization. In July, the July days saw spontaneous armed demonstrations by workers and soldiers in Petrograd, fueled by rumors of an imminent Bolshevik uprising. Though these protests were suppressed by the government, and Lenin was forced into hiding, it demonstrated the growing volatility of the capital and the increasing appeal of radical solutions. Kerensky, now Prime Minister, struggled to maintain control, caught between the demands of the left and the pressure from conservative military leaders. The final nail in the coffin for the provisional government came with the Kornilov affair in August 1917. General Lavr Kornilov, the commander-in-chief of the Russian army, a conservative who believed that only military force could restore order, attempted a coup to crush the Petrograd Soviet and establish a military dictatorship. In a desperate move, Kerensky turned to the Bolsheviks and their armed Red Guards for assistance in defending Petrograd from Kornilov's forces. The Bolsheviks, portraying themselves as the defenders of the revolution against counter-revolution, successfully organized resistance, distributing arms to their supporters and rallying the workers. The qual ultimately fell due to widespread opposition and the mutiny of Kornilov's own troops. However, the affair profoundly strengthened the Bolsheviks, legitimizing their armed forces and demonstrating their organizational capabilities, while simultaneously discrediting Kerensky and exposing the provisional government's fundamental weakness and reliance on its radical opponents. By the autumn of 1917, the provisional government had lost all effective control. The army was disintegrating. Peasants were seizing land across the countryside, and workers were taking over factories. The Bolsheviks, under the brilliant organizational leadership of Leon Trotsky, who had become chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, had gained majorities in the key Soviets of Petrograd and Moscow. Their message of peace, land, and bread resonated powerfully with a population utterly exhausted by war and economic hardship. They also skillfully used propaganda, promising a new world order where the power belonged to the workers and peasants, a stark contrast to the perceived failures of the liberal government. They didn't need to create the conditions for revolution. The provisional government, in its inability to address the core problems, had done that for them. The stage was now set for the final act of the 1917 revolutions, a meticulously planned and swiftly executed seizure of power that would bring the curtain down on the provisional government and usher in an entirely new, and utterly brutal, chapter in Russian history. From the chaos and paralysis of the provisional government, the stage was now meticulously set for the final, decisive act of the 1917 revolutions, the October Revolution. Imagine a seemingly normal autumn night in Petrograd, just weeks after the failed Kornilov coup, but beneath the surface, a clandestine force, organized with ruthless efficiency, was preparing to seize the reins of a collapsing state. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising like February. This was a calculated, strategically executed takeover by the Bolsheviks, a small but disciplined party led by the unyielding will of Vladimir Lenin and the brilliant organizational skills of Leon Trotsky. The provisional government, under Alexander Kerensky, was by this point utterly adrift, having alienated nearly every segment of society. Its continued prosecution of world war was met with mass desertions and widespread mutinies. Its failure to address the crucial issues of land reform and food shortages meant that peasant unrest and urban starvation continued unabated. The dual power structure had crippled its ability to govern effectively, as the Petrograd Soviet, increasingly dominated by Bolsheviks, constantly challenged its authority. Kerensky himself, exhausted and isolated, reportedly spent his final days as premier desperately trying to rally support, a tragic figure presiding over a government that had lost a legitimacy. Lenin, meanwhile, had returned from hiding in Finland in early October, absolutely convinced that the time was ripe for an armed uprising. He argued passionately, often against the initial skepticism of his own party comrades, that the provisional government was on the verge of collapse and that the Bolsheviks, by seizing power in the name of the Soviets, could fulfill the popular demands for peace, land, and bread. His famous slogan, "All power to the Soviets," resonated deeply, offering a clear, radical alternative to the perceived inaction and incompetence of the existing government. The execution of the coup's mastermind by Leon Trotsky, who, as chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, used his position to control the Military Revolutionary Committee, MRC, the Soviet's armed wing. The MRC, largely comprised of loyal Bolshevik Red Guards and sympathetic military units from the Petrograd garrison and the Kronstadt Salers, systematically took control of key strategic points in the capital. Picture this meticulously planned operation. On the night of October 24 a 25, 1917, November 6 a 7 by the Gregorian calendar, while most of Petrograd slept, small, disciplined units moved silently. They seized railway stations, post offices, bridges, power stations, and the state bank, facing little to no resistance. It was an astonishingly bloodless coup, less a popular uprising and more a swift, decisive military takeover of vital infrastructure. The provisional government, with virtually no loyal troops left to defend it, was powerless to resist. The symbolic climax of the October Revolution came on the night of October 25, with the storming of the Winter Palace, the last bastion of the provisional government. While often romanticized in Soviet propaganda as a heroic mass assault, the reality was far less dramatic. It was largely a disorganized affair, with little actual fighting. Members of the provisional government were arrested in the early hours of October 26. Kerensky himself had already fled the capital, attempting to gather loyal troops, an ultimately futile effort. On the same day, as news of the provisional government's overthrow spread, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets convened. With the Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries, SRS, walking out in protest, the Bolsheviks, along with their left SR allies, declared that power had passed to the Soviets. Lenin, appearing at the Congress, triumphantly announced the formation of the new Soviet government, the Council of People's Commissars, Sovnarkom, with himself as its chairman. He immediately issued the decree on peace, calling for an end to the war without annexations or indemnities, and the decree on land, which formally nationalized the land and ordered its redistribution to the peasants, legitimizing the spontaneous land seizures already occurring across the countryside. These decrees, simple, direct, and addressing the most pressing needs of the war-weary and hungry population, instantly cemented Bolshevik popularity, even if their long-term implications were far more complex. The October Revolution marked the end of the brief, chaotic experiment with liberal democracy in Russia and the definitive end of the provisional government. It was, in essence, the coup de grâce for the Russian Empire, even though the formal declaration of the Soviet Union would come later. The centuries-old system of monarchy had been definitively replaced not by a democratic republic, but by a new, revolutionary, and ultimately totalitarian, political order. The empire, having struggled for centuries with reform and repression, had finally collapsed under the weight of war and internal contradictions. The stage was now set for the incredibly bloody and devastating civil war that would follow, as the Bolsheviks fought to consolidate their power against a vast array of internal and external enemies, firmly establishing the Soviet state upon the ashes of the old empire. The story of the Russian Empire, in its traditional sense, had reached its violent, conclusive end. The echo of the rifle shot from the Winter Palace, though largely symbolic, truly marked the final, definitive end of the Russian Empire, even as the new Bolshevik government began its tumultuous struggle for survival. Imagine the world after October 1917, a vast, sprawling land, no longer ruled by its czars, but by a radical, communist party. The immediate aftermath of the October Revolution was not a peaceful utopia promised by the Bolsheviks, but rather the beginning of a brutal and protracted Russian Civil War, 1917 a 1922. This was the final, agonizing death throe of the old order and the violent birth of a completely new one. It was a fight for the soul of Russia, pitting the Bolshevik Reds against a disparate array of whites, a loose coalition of monarchists, liberals, conservatives, and various anti-Bolshevik socialist factions, often supported by foreign interventionist forces from Britain, France, the USA, and Japan, who feared the spread of communism. This conflict plunged Russia into an even deeper abyss of suffering than the World War, a brutal, fratricidal struggle where millions perished from combat, famine, and disease. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's uncompromising leadership and Trotsky's brilliant military organization, moved swiftly to consolidate their power. They established the Cheka, a ruthless secret police force, which employed widespread terror, including mass arrests and executions, to suppress la opposition. This policy of red terror was a brutal but effective tool in crushing dissent and eliminating perceived enemies of the revolution. They also signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March 1918, a humiliating but necessary peace treaty that ceded vast territories and resources to the Central Powers, but crucially allowed the Bolsheviks to focus their limited resources on winning the Civil War. The former imperial family, Nicholas II, Alexandra, and their 5 children, who had been held under house arrest since the February Revolution, met a tragic and brutal end during this period. In July 1918, as white forces approached Ekaterinburg where they were imprisoned, the entire family, along with their doctor and servants, were executed in the basement of the Ipatiev house by Bolshevik guards. This chilling act was a definitive severing of Altais to the monarchical past, ensuring that no pretender could ever rally support around the Romanov name again. Despite being outnumbered and surrounded, the Bolsheviks ultimately triumphed in the Civil War due to several key factors. They controlled the central industrial and population heartland of Russia, giving them a logistical advantage. Their centralized command structure and unified purpose contrasted sharply with the disunity, conflicting goals, and poor coordination among the various white armies. Trotsky's creation of the highly disciplined Red Army, utilizing former Tsarist officers under political commissars and imposing harsh discipline, proved immensely effective. Furthermore, the Bolsheviks successfully appealed to the peasantry by legitimizing their land seizures and promising an end to the war, securing a degree of popular support that the whites, often associated with a return to the old order, could not match. The foreign intervention, rather than weakening the Bolsheviks, often served to rally nationalist sentiment against the invaders, playing directly into the Bolshevik narrative of defending Russia against foreign and counter-revolutionary forces. By 1922, the last significant white forces had been defeated, and the foreign interventions had largely ceased. The Russian Civil War concluded with the Bolsheviks firmly in control of the vast majority of the former Russian Empire's territory. This victory, however, came at an unimaginable cost. Millions dead from fighting, famine, exacerbated by war communism policies, and disease, a shattered economy, and a society traumatized by years of continuous warfare. The end of the Civil War marked the final, irreversible transition from the Russian Empire to a new political entity. In December 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, was officially formed, a declaration that formally enshrined the new communist state built on the ruins of the Russian Empire. This wasn't just a change in name, it represented a fundamental ideological shift from a hereditary monarchy based on the divine right to a one party, nominally socialist state based on Marxist-Leninist principles. The empire, with its tsars, nobility, and centuries of tradition, was officially consigned to the history books, replaced by a system that promised a workers' paradise but would, in practice, become one of the most totalitarian regimes in human history. The legacy of the Russian Empire, its vastness, its multi-ethnic composition, its ingrained autocratic tendencies, and its complex relationship with both East and West, would continue to shape the new Soviet state in profound ways. But the story of Tsarist Russia, that long, often brutal, but undeniably grand narrative, had finally come to an end, closing the book on an era of emperors, serfs, and imperial ambitions, and opening another, equally dramatic, chapter in the vast Eurasian land. So, as the last echoes of the Winter Palaces fade into the annals of history, and the long, complex tapestry of the Russian Empire unfurls its final threads, you can truly appreciate the journey we've taken together. From the earliest whispers of Slavic tribes in the misty forests, through the grand consolidation of Muscovy, the audacious westernizing of Pedro the Great, the enlightened, yet contradictory, rule of Catalina, the chilling repression of Nicholas I, and finally, the slow, agonizing demise under Nicholas II, this empire was a crucible of power, art, and profound human suffering. Its story is one of immense ambition, relentless expansion, and a persistent struggle between the desire for progress and the deep-seated resistance to change. The echoes of its triumphs and tragedies still resonate in the world today, reminding us how deeply the past shapes the present. As the sun sets on this grand narrative, take comfort in knowing that even the mightiest empires eventually yield to the ceaseless march of time, leaving behind only the lessons, the mysteries, and the quiet satisfaction of a story well told.